Thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation today. This is really, really an interesting look at how a community is grappling with many of the same issues that are happening in Western destinations, across our country, especially resort towns. So it is really fascinating to hear from so many of you firsthand about your thoughts about what the right direction is. This has been a transformative time. My own belief is that each of these questions needs to be explored through the lens of multiple audiences, not just tourism stakeholders, but outdoor recreation interests, public land managers, and most importantly, the people who call destinations home. So kudos to you, Jonathan, for assembling that diversity of perspective in this particular presentation, in this particular conference. Let me start off by adding support for the belief that you may have an even busier summer this summer than last summer. This is a slide from a destination analyst presentation just yesterday, showing that many of the top categories where visitors are saying, as a result of the pandemic, their interest has climbed, directly relate to the kind of travel experiences people would be seeking in Jackson, being close to nature, enjoying outdoor recreation, getting off the beaten path, traveling on America's scenic byways, enjoying restaurants and culinary experiences. The things that people don't have that much interest in these days are visiting America's large cities. That interest still remains down, even though it's been steadily climbing, certainly taking a cruise. So yes, you are sitting at the nexus of an opportunity and a challenge. So I was very faithful to the outline that Jonathan shared for our speakers, which was to address how much is too much, how much is too little, what is the right amount, and how do we know? I think we know oftentimes how much is too much when we see it. This is a scene from last summer at Arches National Park. And unfortunately, this scene is played out in too many locations across our nation. And it really goes to a simple definition of tourism: when the demand outpaces the carrying capacity of the tourism ecosystem. When tourism impacts start degrading the experience, harming the environment, especially those fragile environments that tend to attract tourists. Let me talk to you a little bit about that damage. It's not always about the number of visitors. Even a handful of the wrong visitor can damage natural assets. As we saw in Colorado last summer, one person can ignite an historic wildfire. This photo is of a traditional bad actor in Colorado. He's been arrested all over the state for bad behavior in the outdoors. And here he's standing on a log in this treasure called Hanging Lake, which is clearly marked, "Do not stand on the log." But he posted a selfie of himself doing it anyway. We know we have too much tourism when we have unhappy residents, and unaddressed, that can actually translate to a risk not only to the tourism ecosystem, but can translate to pushback against tourism and even loss of funding support and an ultimate demise of tourism assets. And of course, the wrong traveler. I'm pulling a gift from Clueless here. When we attract the wrong traveler, even if they are not arriving in great numbers, they can truly impact the quality of a destination by their behavior that sticks out and upsets other visitors and upsets those people who do call the destination home. We also know we have over-tourism when we have a strained workforce capacity, and this has been an issue that has been extremely challenging, especially during this time of COVID. There is a national shortage of tourism workers, and with rental stock increasingly converted to short-term rentals, we've seen affordable housing become the top issue in many of our states. I snapped this photo on a visit to Crested Butte last week, and I don't know if you can read it, but it says the wooden nickel is hiring. Cooks, servers, line cooks, bartenders, prep cooks, bussers, cooks, and cooks. So essentially, everyone but the owner needs to be hired. And then there's a short note saying, we're looking for a place to live, if you've heard of anything. So, unfortunately, this is a situation we're seeing all too often. So how much is too little tourism? We certainly got a taste of that last year when suddenly our economy shut down. And of course, the most impacted industry across the nation and in many of our locations was tourism. And we saw as the economy started coming back, what we saw was a really uneven recovery. And this graph from the U.S. Travel Association's Travel Recovery Dashboard shows which states, we're suffering the most. The range of this graph is from spending being down 60% to down 15%. And you can see Wyoming was actually at the better end of the scale. But this recovery wasn't just uneven across the country, it was uneven across many states, including Colorado. So Ars Article platform showed that while visitation to many of our rural counties was up, it was way down in many of our past powerhouse destinations, including Denver, where visitation was down 69% for 2 8-month periods of time. That is significant under tourism. This also shows that another factor in under tourism may be the slow recovery of tourism jobs. Leisure and hospitality right now this was from February, accounted for 36% of all of the lost jobs in the nation's economy. The next largest category was government, with just 15% of the lost jobs. We saw that leisure and hospitality suffered some significant declines for jobs lost. The heaviest impacts, of course, were in accommodation and arts, leisure, and recreation. But we also saw heavy impacts in more general aspects of leisure and hospitality as well. And food and beverage did best of all of the categories, but you can see that we were well below the 6% decline in the total economy. So those factors all set the stage for a slow recovery in some parts of our country. It sounds like Jackson is roaring back in some ways in terms of visitation, but you certainly will be subject to the concerns about restoring the workforce and other aspects of the tourism ecosystem. And again, I would say the wrong traveler is a factor in under tourism. And I'll draw upon the Colorado example, which is very famous back in the 1990s when voters rejected funding for a state tourism promotional campaign. What Colorado saw was not so much a decline in visitation, but the sudden arrival of a different kind of visitor. And the cliche was people who bought ice cream cones and t-shirts, as opposed to staying in those country resorts and engaging in those activities that were more likely to drive significant economic impact. It was interesting to hear Anna Olson talking about the impacts of the changes in flight patterns to Jackson Hole this past year. This is in talking with a colleague earlier this week from Hawaii. The islands have experienced approximately a very similar situation. They've had approximately the same number of travelers over the past year, but the traveler mix has changed dramatically. So in the past, about half of Hawaii's travelers come from Japan, but with the shutdown of international travel, plus the arrival of new point-to-point flights that are very value priced, that has brought a lower spending traveler mix to their shores. So they have the same amount of people with all of that implies, but with far less benefit to the islands. And that's one of the challenges that they're going to be tackling with their new destination management work. And I'm sure this conversation played out in Jackson Hole as it did over many Western resort towns over this past year. As the number of visitors shrank, suddenly residents were very excited about their access to parking in front of their favorite stores. The fact that there were no waits, or there were shorter lines. And we all saw fewer impacts on natural resources as well. But the minuses were, certainly without those visitors being there, there was lost business and job opportunity. There was a loss in many locations of vital tax revenues for local services. Our recovery efforts in Colorado were really focused on making certain that we were engaging in driving activities that were generating local taxes. We saw loss of population. There were lots of tourism workers who simply could not wait around for their employer to reopen, and they went elsewhere. And loss of momentum for destination reputation in some cases, and certainly loss of local tourism infrastructure, which is going to be a long-term problem. The loss of restaurants, some hotels have shut down, some marginal attractions have shut down. It is going to be very hard to build back to, in some cases, to build back to prior revenues with the loss of that vital infrastructure to drive spending and engagement. So let's talk a little bit about the ideal state. Let me turn your attention to the town of Breckenridge, which I think did a wonderful job on putting together their destination management plan a couple of years ago. Breckenridge's approach, ultimately, and led by their extraordinary leader, Lucy Kay, ultimately resulted in what essentially was an agreement between residents and the destination management organization and the city government. The vision ultimately was harmony between visitor experience and resident lifestyle. I love how they landed on the idea of harmony as opposed to balance, which sort of implies a give and take and some trade-offs. What they were striving for was harmony. And as I said, it ended up being an agreement around the right amount of tourism. And so through a lot of careful analysis, Breckenridge identified the fact that residents believed that tourism was stressing their lifestyle only 34 days out of the year. And so that really translated to 1 out of every 10 days. Ultimately, that was decided that that was an acceptable level of stress, because in return for experiencing crowded conditions 1 out of every 10 days of the year, Breckenridge, a town of 5,000 people, had the experience of living in a community where 27 new restaurants opened in 1 year. They had a Patagonia store downtown and all kinds of other assets that were driven not by those 5,000 people who lived there, but because they attracted many hundreds of thousands of people to their community. And moving ahead with a very clear-eyed understanding that 1 out of 10 days was okay, that's what Breckenridge, the Breckenridge Tourism Office agreed to manage toward. And so the whole town was on board with that approach. And I think that lays a really solid foundation for a productive way to think about a destination management plan, which I know the Jackson Travel and Tourism Board is very much engaged in. What are those ingredients for success that make an ideal destination management plan and create the right conditions in a community for tourism? As I mentioned earlier, it's really important for demand generation to be focused on the right market segments. Many DMOs in the past were really focused on a come one, come all, a broad-based awareness campaign, just hoping, to get travelers to their doors. Destinations like Jackson are certainly coming to the awareness that the demand generation needs to be focused on the right market segments. The highest, and let me point out, the highest spenders are not automatically the best travelers. It's really critical to agree on the definition of a high value traveler. In Colorado, we certainly did focus on higher spenders, but that wasn't our only criteria for a target. We also focused on what we call drivers of dispersion. These were travelers who took their dollars to less visited destinations. We were also beginning to focus on low impact travelers. We felt that people who traveled and left a light carbon trail would be very desirable travelers in Colorado, and we were on a path to directly target it, encourage more of those travelers to choose Colorado as a destination. And in the past year in particular, we were also shifting focus to travelers who could enhance the diversity of our traveler population. So it's very important for a destination to set its priorities around those market segments and manage to that. Capacity limits. Again, moving away from a more is better mindset to market and manage attraction of the right travelers in the right numbers. And that really goes to identifying your optimal tourism mix. Taking you back to the Breckenridge example, they wanted to manage to a certain number of travelers. And so they shifted their resources to stop marketing in state and market only out of state, because they felt they were already potentially getting plenty of visitors from in-state, and they saw more opportunity in marketing out of state. But setting those limits of acceptable use and capacity, determining the right amount of travelers is extremely critical to these kinds of decisions. And you want to make certain that you're not attracting more visitors than your destination can withstand. And there are some very smart ways of doing that. Also, and then finally, I guess I would talk about the fact that tourism should not be positioned as the end goal, but as a means to an end. And I love Keith's idea about, offering visitors that opportunity to contribute to the destination that they're visiting. So how can we find ways like that, innovative ways like that, to support tourism, to position tourism in support of a community's broader goals, however those are defined, making tourism truly a force for good. So how do we make all of this happen? This is a slight switch from Jonathan's question, when do we know? How do we make it happen? There's been a lot of discussion about this, at least in our chat room, about stepping away from tracking only the growth metrics. And those traditionally have been occupancy, visitor numbers, trip spend, tax generation, job numbers, and start creating a focus on other metrics, additional metrics that can guide strategy. And so one of these, among these metrics, these new metrics, could be stewardship. Management of a destination's core assets and infrastructure, and creating metrics around that, creating metrics around visitor and community attitudes and perceptions to make certain that there is the right tourism balance, and that the behavior of travelers, or the amount of traveler, or the impacts of travelers on the community are not disrupting the lifestyle of the community. It's important to keep a careful watch on that. It's also important to understand ways that, and measure ways that tourism can be a force for good in the destination and in the world. And finally, it's very important to take a well-rounded view of the positives and the negatives of key visitor segments. As a new member of as a new trustee for the Travel Foundation Board of Directors, I've been so taken with this, with their study. It's a white paper, it's publicly available. It's called The Invisible Burden of Tourism, but it really talks about the fact that many tourism marketers and managers typically are only looking at the positive impacts of tourism. When we talk about, economic impact and tax revenue and job creation, we're clearly focusing on the positive impacts of tourism, but calculating the true burden, if you will, the true benefit of tourism requires taking an honest look and having a commitment to examining not just the benefits, but the impacts of tourism. So, and this is, can be creating agreement once there is a clear recognition of both the positive impacts and the negative impacts, then it's possible to create agreement around the desired net benefit of tourism. And then the destination collectively with stakeholders, with residents, with public land managers, with all of the other players in that tourism ecosphere can agree to manage to that goal. So why is this important? It's because this right approach safeguards not only a destination's assets, but sometimes its very character. We've all seen those examples of where tourism destinations have been degraded by a lack of attention to these issues. I think another important aspect for anyone who is in tourism leadership is that taking these kinds of steps truly can insulate a destination from critics and win advocates and ultimately protect funding. It's also very important to take this as an opportunity for tourism practitioners and communities to use tourism as a force for good in their surroundings, and to turn the very real power of tourism to support for a shared vision of how to make a community better and stronger, and a more attractive place, not just for travelers, but for the people who call that destination home. And very importantly, all of this work fulfills another goal because it meets the desires of a growing segment of travelers and outdoor recreationists. I'm going to share with you some data from TripAdvisor. They did a survey last fall, and keep in mind that this included travelers from not just the United States, but the United Kingdom, Italy, Australia, Japan, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, Spain, Germany, and France. But it really offers a note of hope about the power of taking this kind of approach to tourism. 2/3 of travelers are now saying they are willing to pay up to 10% more to support a sustainable business, and nearly a quarter are willing to pay up to 20% more. This marks a huge shift from the past, when people who said they supported sustainability also said they really weren't willing to pay a premium to support sustainable experiences. So that seems to be shifting, and it's shifting fast. 73% of travelers believe hotels need to do more to tackle climate change. And then roughly the same percentages say they'd be more likely to stay at an accommodation if it displayed environmental credentials, and they feel better when staying within eco-friendly accommodations. We are also seeing that 42% of travelers report climate change is impacting their plans to travel. Again, this is probably a reflection more of the European contingent of this survey sample, but this is, again, an issue to keep an eye on, because I think it definitely points us to the importance of embracing low impact travel opportunities and creating those for travelers. Just one final note: when we talk about calculating the net benefit of travel, it is important to note that it encompasses this calculation is intended to encompass all of the impacts and benefits of tourism, really spelled out in the 13 guiding principles of the Future of Tourism Coalition. And it includes everything from impacts on environment to human impacts, even fair pay for workers and accommodations for workers. The whole idea is to really position tourism as a positive force in the world, and move it away from the kinds of practices that make it more of an extractive industry into one that makes it a regenerative, positive industry that feeds a destination and truly enhances the lifestyle. And with that, thank you very much. One of my recent pictures from a visit to Yellowstone in the winter. Thanks so much for allowing me to join you today.